I am going to tell you about invasive species and how they get introduced to an ecosystem. An invasive species is an organism that did not originally come from that ecosystem. They tend to cause damage to other organisms. It results in two species competing with resources. They compete for things like food, water, habitats, and sunlight. For example, when a producer grows in another producer's habitat, there will not be enough resources to supply both of the organisms. They compete for food and water, but only one species can sustain itself and survive. But the question is, how are they introduced into an ecosystem? There are mainly four ways invasive species are introduced to a new ecosystem. The first way is through ships. The ships can carry aquatic organisms from one place to another. They are being taken out of their natural ecosystem and are being taken to a brand new place. The second way is through wooden products. If a wood product from China or Australia gets imported over to America, the product can be infested with termites. And once they are released into the wild, they interfere with other organisms in that ecosystem. The third way is from ornamental plants. For example, many people buy mistletoe for Christmas, but if it is released into the wild, it becomes a huge problem. It can spread very quickly and it can steal sunlight and water along with nutrients from producers, causing them to die. The fourth and final way is from bringing exotic animals and turning them into pets. If it were to escape, it would run to the wild, reproduce, and turn into an invasive species. Hello. Today I am going to tell you how an invasive species affects the ecosystem's biotic and abiotic components. In the last video I explained invasive species and how they get introduced in an ecosystem. Sometimes, invasive species get introduced to a brand new ecosystem. But the question is, how does it affect the ecosystem? The invasive species can have a really bad impact on an ecosystem's health. When the invasive species moves in, they feed on other organisms. It can drive some organism to extinction. But those organisms that they are feeding off of can also play a huge role in the food chain. That results in two species competing for resources and prey. There is only enough food and resources for one, so one has to die off. When two species compete for the same organism, that species or organism will decrease and most likely become in danger of extinction in that ecosystem. The ecosystem and the food chain will decline because an invasive species moves into a brand new ecosystem. These are the biggest impacts. Today I am going to talk about how invasive species affect competition. When an invasive species moves in, it will most likely result in the competition of two different species. Competition is where two organisms try to fight for resources like food, water, and other essential needs for survival. The invasive species are going to go after prey that another species already feeds off of to survive. The problem with that is there are only enough resources for one species. That is when they are forced to compete for survival. One of the species is going to die off due to lack of food sources. All of this happens because an invasive species was brought to a brand new ecosystem. It is not the invasive species' fault that they have to compete, it is just doing whatever it can do to survive. In the case of competition, one species will always be driven out of their ecosystem, or one species is going to perish. The species' prey is going to dramatically reduce. The ecosystem's health is going to decline. Invasive species have always been a huge issue. This is how invasive species affect competition in an ecosystem. Invasive species coming into new ecosystems have been a huge problem. They cause two species to compete for survival. But what have people tried to do to get rid of invasive species? The National Wildlife Federation has been trying to stop invasive species. Here is what they have tried. They have established a policy to restrict the shipping of potential damaging plants or animals. They have started funds to help save the oceanic ecosystems. They have prevented Asian carps from entering the Great Lakes. They have educated gardeners to plant native plants and to remove invasive plants. About 185 invasive species have been introduced to the Great Lakes ballast water. Ballast water is just taken from the ocean, but when they get it, plants and animals are picked up. The National Wildlife Federation has been educating and informing to treat ballast water. They also try to detect it early so they can respond quickly. All attempts have been successful, but it just takes lots of effort. I personally believe the best way to stop invasive species from invading ecosystems is to stop them from reproducing. If you do not give them time to reproduce, they will not disturb the ecosystem and eventually die off. There are the best ways that have tried to stop invasive species.